Welcome back to Bourbon Hunter, the channel where we chase great bottles, break down bourbon myths, and occasionally make some questionable life choices, all in the name of whiskey research. Here, we're diving into the stories behind the bottles, the trends shaking up the bourbon world, and the pours that'll make you say, yep, that's going on the top shelf. So grab a glass, settle in, and let's hunt some flavor, because around here, the bourbon's bold, the jokes are bad, and the hunt is always on. Think your favorite bourbon is safe on the shelf? Think again. This is a story of Pappy Gate, missing Pappy Van Winkle bottles, stolen barrels from Buffalo Trace and Wild Turkey, and a group of insiders who treated Kentucky's finest whiskey like cash. We're diving deep into how the theft started, how it was discovered, and the web of greed, secrecy, and skullduggery that shook the bourbon world. If you've ever hunted rare bottles, chased legends, or wondered if every limited release is legit, you're going to want to stick around. Because in bourbon country, sometimes the angel's share isn't the only thing disappearing. In 2013, a quiet warehouse in Frankfort, Kentucky became the stage for one of the most audacious bourbon thefts in American history. More than 200 bottles of ultra rare Pappy Van Winkle vanished from Buffalo Trace Distillery, a whiskey so coveted that millionaires fight over the chance to own a single bottle. What started as simple inventory discrepancy would unravel into a years long investigation, criminal indictments, insider betrayals, and a story that would capture the imagination of bourbon lovers and true crime fans alike. This is, of course, Pappy Gate. In 2013, something unusual was happening at Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. Bottles were disappearing. Not just a few, but roughly 65 cases, about 200 bottles of the ultra rare Pappy Van Winkle had vanished from the warehouse. Among the missing stock were the family reserve 20-year and 13-year rye bottles, so scarce and coveted that collectors and bourbon enthusiasts would go to almost any lengths to get them. The incident quickly earned a nickname, Pappy Gate, and it didn't stay a local curiosity for long. The combination of rarity, value, and sheer audacity drew national and international attention, instantly making headlines in the whiskey world and beyond. For distillery management, it was shocking. How could such a tightly controlled warehouse lose hundreds of bottles? And for bourbon fans, it was tantalizing. A real-life heist involving one of the most coveted whiskeys in the world. This wasn't just theft. It was the beginning of a story about insider access, rare bourbon, and a scheme that would grow into Kentucky's most infamous whiskey heist since Prohibition. To understand why Pappy Van Winkle inspires near fanatical devotion, you first have to understand scarcity. Pappy isn't just another bourbon. The distillery produces only 7,000 to 8,000 cases a year, a fraction of the output of major brands like Jim Beam. That scarcity turns each bottle into a prized collectible, almost like owning a rare work of art. But rarity alone doesn't explain the obsession. Pappy Van Winkle is renowned for its taste and quality. The long aging process, the careful selection of barrels, and the unique mash bill create a flavor profile that enthusiasts describe as rich, complex, and unforgettable. For collectors, a bottle isn't just a drink, it's a sensation, a story, and a symbol of excellence. And then there's status. Owning Pappy is a badge of distinction. When millionaires or serious collectors acquire a bottle, it signals taste, access, and exclusivity. Some bottles sell for thousands of dollars on the secondary market, and auctions can spark bidding wars that will make headlines. The thrill of the hunt, the chance to snag a bottle that's almost impossible to find, becomes as intoxicating as the bourbon itself. Finally, there's the cultural mythology. Pappy Van Winkle has decades of history, tied to the family tradition and Kentucky heritage. Collectors aren't just chasing a drink, they're connecting with a story, a legacy, and a part of bourbon lore that few other bottles can offer. In short, Pappy Van Winkle isn't just bourbon, it's rarity, craftsmanship, prestige, and legend, all bottled together. And that's why when bottles go missing, as they did in Pappygate, it's not just theft, it's a crime against a cultural treasure. As investigators dug deeper into the missing Pappy Van Winkle, a troubling pattern began to emerge. This wasn't the work of a random thief. Insider access made it all too easy. Employees had keys, codes, and intimate knowledge of the warehouse layout, giving them the ability to remove bottles, sometimes hundreds at a time, without raising immediate alarms. Leads soon pointed to Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger, a warehouse supervisor at Buffalo Trace. Law enforcement followed a tip and raided his property, recovering not only stolen bourbon barrels, but also steroids, a surprising addition to the story that revealed a pattern of risk-taking and secrecy. Kurtzinger reportedly didn't just pocket the bourbon for himself. He sold bottles to friends, collectors, those willing to pay a premium for the impossible to find Pappy Van Winkle. What started as a few missing bottles had escalated into systematic insider operation, fueled by rarity, opportunity, and demand. By 2015, the investigation into Pappy Gate had gathered enough evidence to bring formal charges. A Franklin County grand jury indicted 10 individuals, including warehouse employees and outside associates, in what authorities described as a sophisticated and coordinated scheme. Among those arraigned were Mark Sean Searcy, Dusty Adkins, who appeared in court and entered not guilty pleas. Their cases highlighted the fact that multiple people were allegedly involved in the thefts rather than a single rogue employee. The charges were serious: theft, receiving stolen property, and participation in a broader criminal syndicate that had been operating over several years. This was more than a few missing bottles. It was a network of insiders exploiting access to some of the most coveted bourbon in the world. Here are the primary people indicted in the PappyGate bourbon theft ring, the core cast of characters behind the heist. Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger, the alleged ringleader, longtime warehouse loading dock employee at Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. Authorities say he leveraged his insider access to orchestrate thefts of barrels and bottles from Buffalo Trace and other distilleries. Side note, he was an employee of like 26 years. Julie Kurtzinger, wife of Gilbert, though not a distillery employee, she was indicted alongside him and charged as part of the syndicate. Mark Searcy, from Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, employer listed as Wild Turkey Distillery, indicted as a member of the network, accused of helping steal barrels assigned for delivery to be handed over to Kurtzinger for resale. So Mark was a truck driver, and he would go from Wild Turkey to Camp Nelson. But first, he would stop and unload barrels to give to Gilbert. Sean Ballard, from Richmond, Kentucky, one of the indicted associates in the syndicate. Ronnie Hubbard, from Georgetown, Kentucky, indicted as part of the criminal syndicate. Dusty Adkins, sometimes Dusty Adkins, from Georgetown, Kentucky, indicted as part of the ring, later admitted involvement, acting as a middleman in the sale of stolen bourbon and barrels. So Dusty was on the softball team, and at first he was like, I didn't buy anything. And then it came out due to text messages that were found during the investigation that he had been involved in purchasing. Christopher Preston, from Frankfort, Kentucky, described as a Buffalo Trace employee and indicted in the syndicate. Joshua Preston, son of Christopher Preston, from Frankfort, Kentucky, indicted alongside his father in syndicate charges. Robert McKinney, from Frankfort, Kentucky, another indicted associate. Altogether, these 9 or 10, depending on reporting, individuals were indicted as part of what prosecutors called a criminal syndicate, accused of coordinated theft of high-end bourbon, barrels, and bottles, illegal distribution, and even trafficking in steroids and paraphernalia. When law enforcement finally cracked open the case, they didn't just uncover missing bottles. They unearthed a web of individuals tangled together by greed, access, and scheme. At the center was Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger, a man trusted with bourbon's precious cargo at Buffalo Trace, who allegedly turned that trust into opportunity. Alongside him stood his wife, Julie, and a roster of associates across Kentucky, former distillery workers, everyday residents, distributors, and middlemen, all drawn into what prosecutors called a criminal syndicate. Among them was Mark Searcy from Wild Turkey, accused of diverting barrels meant for warehouses. There was Sean Ballard from Richmond, Ronnie Hubbard from Georgetown, Dusty Adkins eventually admitting his role in moving bourbons in barrels, and multiple Prestons from Frankfurt connected to the distillery network. The cast also included Robert McKinney, completing a team bound by organized crime, bourbon lust, and betrayal. What began as missing inventory turned into an indictment of nearly 10 individuals, a story of trust broken, behind-the-scene deals, and the dark underbelly of bourbon's rarest corners. In 2016, Julie Kurtzinger, wife of ringleader Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger, entered what's known as an Alford plea for second-degree possession of steroids and possession of drug paraphernalia. An Alford plea is unique. She did not admit guilt, but acknowledged that the prosecution's evidence was strong enough that a jury could likely convict her. Ultimately, the court sentenced her to 12 months of incarceration, but the sentence was suspended in favor of 2 years of probation, allowing her to avoid serving time in jail as long as she complied with the court's conditions. Pappy Gate wasn't just a story about stolen bourbon. It was also a story about people, choices, and the complex interplay between temptation and family life. At the center were Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger and his wife, Julie, a couple whose personal and professional lives became entwined with one of the largest bourbon heists in Kentucky history. Toby, a trusted warehouse supervisor at Buffalo Trace, had access few others enjoyed. He knew the ins and outs of the distillery, where barrels were stored, when shipments arrived, and how to move bottles unnoticed. But behind the logistics, there was a personal side, his family, and Julie, his wife, became part of the story when she entered an Alford plea in 2016 for possession of steroids and drug paraphernalia. Julie didn't admit to wrongdoing, yet she acknowledged the prosecution could convict. This meant she accepted responsibility in a legal sense, while still maintaining her innocence. This intersection of bourbon theft and drug charges paints a picture of a household operating in the shadow of risk and secrecy. While Toby allegedly orchestrated the movement and sale of stolen bourbon, Julie's legal troubles, though separate, added a layer of complexity to their family dynamic. Here were two people navigating the consequences of high-stake decisions, each connected by love, loyalty, and circumstance. Their story adds a human element to Pappy Gate. It's easy to think of the heist as a series of barrels and bottles, a crime solved with indictments and arrest. But at the center were people with relationships, routines, and obligations. A married couple balancing risk, desire, and consequence. Their choices didn't just affect themselves, they rippled through families, communities, and even the bourbon world at large. In many ways, the Kurtzingers illustrate a recurring theme in true crime, and it's barely abstract. It's embedded in human behavior, opportunity, and environment. The stolen bourbon wasn't just a product, it was a catalyst that exposed vulnerabilities, both professional and personal. Steroids, bourbon, legal battles. Each element interwove into a story that was as much about family as it was about crime. For viewers and followers of Pappy Gate, the Kurtzingers' tale is a reminder that behind headlines and high-dollar heists are real people facing choices with consequences. It's a story of trust broken, of temptation met, and of a family navigating the fallout in a way that's sometimes sympathetic, sometimes shocking, but always human. In September 2017, the spotlight fell squarely on Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger. The warehouse supervisor at Buffalo Trace Distillery formally pleaded guilty to the theft of more than $100,000 worth of bourbon, a haul that included priced bottles from both Buffalo Trace and Wild Turkey. Less than a year later, on June 2nd, 2018, Kurtzinger was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Yet, in a surprising twist, he only served 30 days behind bars. During the investigation and prosecution, authorities recovered stolen barrels and bottles, including the coveted Pappy Van Winkle, and seized steroids from his property, underscoring the complex and illicit activities that had taken place behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the legal saga was not yet complete. Remaining charges against Mark Searcy and other co-conspirators were still pending, leaving parts of the story unresolved and hinting the broader scope of the theft network. As the courtroom proceedings unfolded, sketches captured the tense moments of arraignment and sentencing. Judges presiding, attorneys presenting evidence, and the accused sitting before the court, facing the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, investigators recovered barrels and bottles that had been spirited away from distilleries. Among the haul were the ultra-rare Pappy Van Winkle bottles, coveted by collectors and emblematic of the high stakes involved in the heist. A timeline reveals the arc of the case from the plea in September 2017 to Kurtzinger's sentencing on June 2, 2018, and continuing through the pending charges against Mark Searcy and other co-conspirators. Each point on the timeline would tell a piece of the story, a story of theft, prosecution, and the pursuit of justice in Kentucky's bourbon world. Together, the images would be courtroom sketches, recovered barrels, bottles of Pappy, and the timeline of legal events, creating a vivid picture of Pappy Gate, capturing both the human drama and the tangible evidence of one of the most infamous bourbon heists in history. When authorities recovered the stolen bourbon, it wasn't just bottles and barrels. It was evidence of a crime that shook the bourbon world. From Pappy Van Winkle Family Reserve to barrels of high-value wild turkey, the haul represented more than $100,000 in rare whiskey, a sum that can make many collectors' heart race. Beyond the financial value, the theft had a cultural impact. Pappy Van Winkle isn't just a drink. It's a symbol of rarity, craftsmanship, and Kentucky bourbon heritage. Collectors, enthusiasts, and even casual fans watched in disbelief as these treasures were stolen, sold on the black market, and ultimately returned. The recovery of the bourbon sent a clear message. Even the most coveted bottles are not immune to crime, and the reverence for Pappy Van Winkle only grew. The theft highlighted the lengths people will go for access to something rare and valuable, and reminded the bourbon community of the fragility of trust in the world built on tradition and scarcity. In the summer of 2021, the story of Pappy Gate reached a global audience with the release of Netflix docuseries Heist. The final episode, premiering on July 14th, devoted a two-part segment titled The Bourbon King to the infamous bourbon theft. The series dives deep into the mystery surrounding the 2013 $100,000 Pappy Van Winkle theft, raising questions about the true culprit. While Toby Kurtzinger had pleaded guilty and was convicted, the docuseries points a finger at Greg Anglin, a Buffalo Trace employee, suggesting the theft may have been more complicated than previously reported. Beyond the specifics of who did what, Kurtzinger's story captured viewers for another reason. It revealed a culture of theft among distillery employees and offered a glimpse into the audacity and the insider knowledge required to execute such a heist. His actions and the story that unfolded around them fascinated audiences and cemented PappyGate as one of the most notorious bourbon scandals in modern history. Rare whiskey has a way of capturing the imagination. It's more than just a drink. It's a symbol of craftsmanship, scarcity, and status. For collectors, a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle or a limited edition bourbon isn't simply a product on a shelf. It's a treasure that represents decades of expertise, patience, and heritage. The thrill of the hunt is part of the lure. When supply is limited and demand is sky high, auctions become battlegrounds. Waiting lists stretch for years, and every bottle carries a story. For enthusiasts and millionaires alike, owning one of these bottles signals access, taste, and exclusivity. Public fascination isn't just about collecting, it's about connection. Connecting to the history of the distillery, the family traditions behind each bottle, and the legends that grow around each release. This reverence transforms whiskey into a cultural phenomenon, turning thefts like Pappy Gate into headline-grabbing stories and cementing rare bourbon as an icon of both luxury and lore. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the consequences for those involved in Pappy Gate began to take shape. At the center, Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger, the alleged ringleader, faced the brunt of the law. In June 2018, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for orchestrating the theft of more than $100,000 in bourbon, including rare bottles of Pappy Van Winkle and wild turkey. Surprisingly, he served only 30 days behind bars, a twist that underscored the complexities of plea agreements and testimony arrangements. Julie Kurtzinger did not admit guilt, but acknowledged the prosecution's evidence would lead to a conviction. The court suspended her 12-month sentence in favor of 2 years probation, allowing her to avoid jail time while remaining accountable. Other members of the syndicate faced varying degrees of accountability. Dusty Adkins, implicated as a middleman in moving stolen bourbon, eventually pleaded guilty, though specific sentencing details were less public. Mark Searcy, a former Wild Turkey employee who allegedly diverted barrels to Kurtzinger, faced pending charges, leaving some aspects of the network unresolved at the time. Together, these sentences reflected the scope and seriousness of the crime, an organized syndicate exploiting insider access to steal some of the most coveted bourbon in the world. From multi-year prison sentences to probation agreements, the legal outcomes balance punishment with cooperation, leaving a legacy that continues to fascinate bourbon enthusiasts, law enforcement, and the public alike. And so concludes the story of Pappy Gate, a heist that wasn't just about bourbon, but about trust, temptation, and the lengths people will go to chase something rare and coveted. From the warehouse at Buffalo Trace to the backyards where barrels were stashed, the crime touched lives, families, and community built on tradition. At the center were the Kurtzingers, whose personal choices and legal battles remind us that behind every headline are real people navigating complex circumstances. Pappy Gate also left an indelible mark on bourbon culture. It showcased the obsession with rarity, the allure of Pappy Van Winkle, and the fervor of collectors worldwide. The story continues to captivate audiences through documentaries, news coverage, and pulp culture references, proving that even in the world of fine whiskey, drama, intrigue, and high stakes are never far behind. As the barrels are returned and the bottles are cataloged, Pappy Gate remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that desire and opportunity, when combined, can lead to audacious acts, but also that justice, persistence, and a community's vigilance can restore balance. Whether you're a bourbon enthusiast, a true crime fan, or simply fascinated by the unexpected stories hidden behind closed doors, Pappy Gate stands as a legendary chapter in the world of whiskey, a story of crime, consequence, and culture distilled into every barrel, bottle, and headline. And that's another pour down. If you enjoyed hanging out in the hunt today, don't leave me standing here like an empty bottle on a Sunday morning. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment about what I should track down next. Remember, bourbon may age gracefully, but my YouTube channel only grows if you feed it. I'll see you in the next hunt. Cheers, bourbon hunters.